I want to share with you the best podcast apps for listening on iOS, Android, and also smart devices. And the thing is, when you think about the best podcast apps for listening, you got to really ask yourself, what is a podcast app in the first place? Okay, now podcast apps are listening directories you can download and install on your device. It can be your Android device or iOS device, and commonly this will be your smartphone. Though it could also be anything from your Apple Watch to Amazon Echo smart speaker. So that's kind of cool to really think about, right? So put simply, one of these apps can be your one-stop shop for listening to and subscribing to your favorite podcast. And the thing is that when you think about podcast apps, you got to really think about, let's say, efficiency, affordability, that's for sure, but also it has to be very, very convenient. Okay, now how do podcast apps really work? Well, designs and features vary from podcast app to podcast app, but they all essentially work in the same way. So there is the main interface, right? So which usually shows you a selection of podcasts to help you get started. So it really depends on your settings, though. It depends on the kind of preferences that you have in the first place. And when I speak about a selection of podcasts, these tend to be in the form of top picks, charts, or other curated suggestions based again on your preferences. And you might find something you like in the recommendations, but the real value of podcast apps is really in their search function. So you can type the name of a show, a topic, a keyword, or a question when looking for something new to listen to, and it will actually throw up a list of podcasts or even podcast episodes. That's kind of similar to YouTube recommendations, okay? And so now podcast apps organize your picks based on your search history, your listening history, but also your preferences. I've said this before, and you can actually record on a podcast app. That's really not a big. It's not really that complicated. It's just that you have. Well, I mean, first of all, you have to have a podcast, and you also have a certain listenership. Once you actually are able to have that listenership, you can actually contact those apps. I mean, there are ways to actually apply for your podcast to actually be visible in the search results. So that's really, really very convenient, and it's very fast too. So when I talk about the best podcast app for listening, you got to really ask yourself, what's the best podcast app for your tastes and habits? Because everything revolves around your specific tastes and habits. Because otherwise, those apps are going to lose their value, because if they can't really create let's say, curate a bespoke selection of podcasts for their users, they're not really worth anything. Okay, so to start, you want to think about what kinds of podcasts you enjoy and how you listen, because those are the two things you need to think about. What kind of podcasts you enjoy, and what's the manner in which you want to listen to those podcasts. Are you listening to interview or discussion shows with just a few voices and a little bit of music at the beginning and the end? Do you listen to shows with let's say, multi-layered sound design, many distinct voices and cliffhanger content? Are you using your car as a speakers while driving? I mean, it's all about going back to what I said a little earlier. It depends on your preferences, okay? Do you listen with headphones while multitasking or relaxing, let's say chilling at the beach or just cooking in your kitchen? Do you tell a smart speaker to play something while you go about your business? Are you really hungry for a story, thirsty for information, or just needing something to pass the time? So you got to really ask yourself what kind of preferences you have, okay? So everything revolves around your psychology, but also your habits and your routines. So whatever your needs are, there is a podcast app that really focuses on your needs and others that don't. Let me really share with you some of the features that you may find in different apps. This way you can narrow down what you want most in a podcast listening app. Now, first you have car listening and navigation. So you have an app that actually will help you out. And not all voices are alike, and some listeners want control over how podcast voices are presented. Many podcast listening apps give users a variable speed playback feature. Some shorten silences rather than making the speaker sound like a chipmunk. Okay, if you want your daily news podcast in a third of the time, this is a helpful feature. And so this is kind of cool. So you have a car listening navigation, you have controlling voices and amplifying audio, so that's kind of cool. Another option is what's called voice boost. This makes the speaker's voice stand out from the background sound more. If you listen to podcasts with multi-layered sound design, this helps you focus on the primary speakers instead of have all sound washed together. And you also have, when you think about a podcast app, I want you to think of a tool that can improve audio quality a lot. I mean, of course, a podcast sound quality is the primary responsibility of its creator. But the thing is that some podcast apps have functionalities and modules to sort of really improve the audio quality a lot. So, and that's great. I'm still talking to you about the best podcast app for listening on iOS, Android, and so on and so forth. And let me talk to you about the podcast feed organization process and discovery. Okay. Now, some people open up their podcast listening app and scroll through what's trending. That's for sure. Maybe that's you. Maybe that's me. Others want to hear their preferred podcast right away. Some are in a Wi-Fi enabled environment when they listen. Others can stream and have to download their favorites. So what your podcast listening app lets you do with how and when you listen can actually be crucial to your enjoyment. That's what we call LX, the listener experience. Okay. And the listener experience is really quite essential when it comes to podcasting, not only from the podcaster's perspective, but also from the listener's perspective. Okay. And so you can open up a podcast listening app and feel you have to listen to what it tells you to. Other podcast listening apps feel like you open the closet and find the shirt you want right away. So it's all about organization. It's all about efficiency. Okay. So it's also all about user experience, what we call on this show listener experience. Okay. Now the thing is that one thing I want you really I want you to think about when you actually contemplate the best podcast apps for listening. You want to think about three important elements, and that's something that I actually like to call the magic trifecta. So ease of navigation, nothing really complicated. You want to really have things. You want to have the best podcast for you, curated very quickly. Nothing really complicated. Don't try to really go for an app that's making things complicated. So ease of navigation is number one. You also want to have audio customization. Audio customization means what? It means that you are able to level the sound quality based on the environment where you are at, but also based on your preferences. And you also want to have access, and that's the third leg of this trifecta, access to a podcast selections and discovery. Okay, so that's an important element to think about, especially when it comes to scalability. In other words, your ability to actually listen to several podcasts. Let's say, binge listen to podcasts. So that's an important element to think about. Let me talk to you now about the most popular podcast app. Okay, it's important to really think about the fact that when you think about podcast apps, of course, everybody thinks right away about Apple Podcast and Spotify. That's for sure. Those are the biggest in this environment. But you also have Google Podcast. Okay, but I want to first talk to you about Apple Podcast. I mean, the old dog might not be the best podcast app, but Apple Podcast arguably grew the medium more than anything else ever has when it became a default app on the iPhone. And Apple Podcast users can rate and review podcasts, so this can be useful when deciding which shows to try out or not. But it just looks a little chunky, and it's not really that easy to navigate. So if there is an option to create a personalized playlist in Apple Podcast, it's not really evident. You have to make do with options on individual episodes, such as listen now and listen later in one queue. And you can skip forward or back by 15 or 30 seconds or speed up playback. But there's a little more on offer here, sadly. It's really surprising because Apple is really known for coming up with a very creative product, very innovative products. I'm really surprised that they haven't really invested in this part of the business. Really sad. And but having said that, Apple Podcast does have one of the better search capabilities in the podcast app sphere. Apple Podcasts seem to be capable of searching the audio itself in podcast episodes, so this increases your chances of finding the exact thing you are after. You might just want to hop onto another app to actually download and listen to it. You also have Spotify. So just in case you've been living under a rock, Spotify is a music streaming service that has also become a popular podcast platform in recent years. And the company has gone into podcasting heavily, making a lot of waves and spending a lot of cash. But as a listening app, it just seems a bit, meh. On the plus side, though, you can create playlists with your favorite podcast episodes and even mix them in among your favorite songs. And there are some exclusive podcasts you'll find on there that you won't get anywhere else too. So that's kind of cool. You can change the speed and skip back or forward 15 seconds. You can also rate podcasts, though there's no review capability. So, it's just pretty basic though. And if you listen to music in the app, the podcast inside of it can end up getting a bit lost. The general search tab is going to throw up songs as well as podcast episodes too. Next, you have a Google Podcast, and this is the third player here. So when any podcast hosting provider publishes overall listening stats, you'll tend to see in Google Podcasts in third place behind Apple and Spotify. They might be a distant third, but that's still a significant market share. Again, Google Podcast is all right for getting you started, but it's a bit limited, especially for the power user. It also requires you to sign into your Google account if you are using it on your smartphone. So it's a bit of a faff when you think about it. So it's not really really interesting from that point of view. And you can also think about Google Play Music, but this is not really for podcasting. So which podcast apps are any good? Okay, now the three that I just shared with you a little earlier might be hamstrung by some listening limitations, but there are a lot of excellent podcast app options out there. So here I want to share with you our top picks when it comes to podcast apps. So the best podcast app for listening on Android, you have Pocket Casts, okay? And so before Spotify waltzed into the podcast scene, Pocket Cast was actually preferred by Android users. And though most podcast listening apps are free, this used to have a $4 to $5 price tag. And Pocket Cast moved to a freemium model in like a little before COVID, okay? The app and most features are free, but subscription allows some special perks, such as 10 gigabytes of cloud storage for Plus subscribers. So it's become very popular regardless of operating system. So that's kind of cool in terms of flexibility. That's really fantastic. If you are looking for the best podcast app for listening on iPhone or iOS, think about Overcast, okay? And so Overcast has all the good features of Pocket Cast and is popular amongst the power user podcast listeners. It assumes that you already know what you want to hear. On first opening, it shows no podcast, but it asks you to add some instead of displaying ranked charts. So that's kind of cool because it gives you more control, more freedom, if you will, okay? And so this is really good. So you are able to do a lot of things. You can set different speeds, shorten silences, choose whether or not to boost the voices, and know that those settings will remain for each episode of that podcast, but not others. You can create queues and set them up so that new episodes of the podcast you added will automatically download to those queues. You can choose whether to have all podcasts stream, all download automatically, or whether to stream or download on a podcast by podcast basis. So this is really good, especially when it comes to having the functionality actually scaled later on. Okay, now you have to actually pay a little bit. I mean, Overcast lets you share episodes on social media too, even letting you create a custom clip. We love that aspect of that feature here. Now the app itself overall is actually free with the subscription option. So for about $9 to $25 a year, you can actually upload files and or remove the banner ads for other podcasts at the bottom of your app's screens. So this is really good. Next, you have a Podcast Addict. This is another wonderful app. This is actually the number one podcast app on Android. It boasts over 10 million downloads, 5K reviews, and an average rating of 4.7 over 5. Fantastic. There is a free version and a premium one, which you can get in exchange for a donation. The free version is pretty robust, and we were really surprised when we checked it out. So it was really great. It has a great car listening feature, and you can search for a podcast in other languages too. So this is really fantastic. You also have Apollo. Apollo is the best podcast app for fiction podcasts in our view. As more and more podcasts are launched every year, it's feasible that we might start to see podcast apps niche down into topics or themes. That's an important element to think about, especially as the market is trying to really centralize or even like consolidate. Okay, and so one early example of this is Apollo, an app dedicated exclusively to fiction, podcast, and audio drama. So those types of shows were notoriously hard to find for many years, and Apple held out for a long time before it finally dedicated a category to the medium. Okay, even then, back in the, I'm speaking about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Back then, search categories could actually show you top recommendations, but they rarely took the search function into action. More niche apps like this mean that the overall subject matter is already a given, and it's just a case of finding the stuff within that subject matter that you would like to listen to. So this is kind of cool. And what you want to do is with Apollo, you want to really make sure that you go to your settings, and so once you actually once you have the right filters in place, those filters will apply to all podcasts, not just one. So that gives you a lot of flexibility, especially if you want to actually have the same settings for all podcasts, like such as sound quality, for instance, or even the topic that you want to listen to. So this is kind of cool because it gives you, again, going back to what I said, it gives you a lot of flexibility, but also a lot of efficiency, and that's kind of cool, especially when you have those long trips and you just want to listen to podcasts. You want to binge listen to podcasts. That's kind of cool. I want to share with you other popular podcast apps that are out there. Okay, some other popular podcasts are, you have Castbox, for instance. Castbox market itself as the best free podcast apps for like with over 95 to 100 million volumes of content on Android, Apple iPhone, Amazon Alexa, Google Home, CarPlay, and Android Auto. So that's kind of cool. You also have Amazon Music, Audible. So if you are going to take over the world, you need to also have a podcast app built in, and Amazon does. And if you are not an Audible subscriber, you can use that as your podcast app too. Audible has a lot of exclusive content, so you'll have even more options for your next binge listen. You also have TuneIn Radio. So TuneIn Radio is another free app with access to 100,000 real radio stations and 5.7 to 6 million podcasts. They also have a premium version in which you are able to remove all banner and pre-roll ads. By the way, we have actually reviewed TuneIn and Audible on other shows, by the way. And you also have Podcast Republic. This popular podcast app has over 4 million downloads and over 90,000 reviews. And Podcast Republic actually has an easy to navigate interface, and its features will appeal to complete beginners and power listeners alike. You also have Player FM. So with over 100,000 to 150,000 reviews, Player FM also offers features like offline listening and syncing across multiple devices. So we love the syncing across multiple devices. This is kind of cool. And even better, you can import your own video and audio files using the app's tools and features to organize and consume them. That's really good. You also have Stitcher, and so Stitcher actually is a great app. But we heard that they are actually closing. They closed in 2023, but they're still open as of the date of this show. Maybe they will close in the next few years. Who knows? So you also have Podchaser. So Podchaser is actually a network that powers discovery. This is really good. This is not really a mobile app, but rather a web app. It's worth mentioning though, because it's a great way to listen to podcasts. And Podchaser is actually a website that actually offers a social media element that others lack. So users can actually post reviews, create profiles, curate actually lists, and connect with other podcast listeners and creators. So that's really good in terms of flexibility and also a variety. That's really fantastic. Okay, that's what we call podcast democracy. So bottom line is, what's the best podcast app for you? It really depends, because podcast apps are often free, or at least have decent free versions. So there is no reason that you can't try several and see what you think are the best podcast apps for iPhone or Android, right? Because Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts might be the household names with the most users, but you might want to opt for Overcast, Pocket Casts, or Podcast Edits if you are looking for something that blows them out of the water with features, customizations, and also ease of use. Okay. So, in conclusion to this conversation, I spoke to you about the best podcast apps for listening on iOS and Android. So, I gave you the features you need to really think about. I also spoke to you about the top three players in this field: the Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, and also share with you a few other podcast apps you might want to think about. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.